I'd like to introduce JP as our first speaker this morning, and he'll be covering the very first topic, which is the HondaJet planning and risk mitigation.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, good morning, everybody. JP, nice to meet you all. Chief Pilot here for Volato. Which of you three right here want to help me be my little slide clicker today? Mr. Travis, come on up, sir. Lucky number one. There you go. All right. First off, thank you for everybody for showing up today. This is obviously a pretty momentous occasion for us all. I think every stakeholder in the HondaJet ecosystem is here this morning. So we're honored to have you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being able to participate in the Safety Summit. A little bit about me. I spent 7 years with the U.S. Army as a prop and rotor mechanic working on Apaches. And then when sequestration hit, I ended up going to civilian flight school, became a pilot, flight instructed, spent 4 years at Compass Airlines when COVID hit. Flew medevac during the height of the pandemic, ended up getting my bachelor's in aviation safety, aviation science, and then a master's in aviation safety. Came on with a different operator, flying the HondaJet. Now I'm here at Volato, and made my way up as a training captain, check airman, assistant chief pilot, now chief pilot. So I've got about 800 and change hours in the Honda, and 300 some plus odd landings in various different types of conditions. We train, we evaluate on it. So that's a little bit of my background. And so today we're going to talk about the planning phase of the Honda. How do we get the most performance and capability out of the jet without compromising safety? We're going to talk about the phone booth. I'm not sure how many fighter pilots we have in here. I think there was only one, and that's Mr. Mike Murphy.
Attack pilots.
Okay. We'll take attack pilots too, but we'll get to the concept of the phone booth. Talk about the capability and mission set of the aircraft. Weight and balance, how critical that is. Flight phase, terminal phase, and then we'll open it up. So here's the other thing, guys. I'm sure everybody has been here that's had somebody just reading off the slide. I actually like to make mine a little bit more interactive, so I will be soliciting feedback from the audience. So you guys get to have a little bit more excitement this morning. Next slide, please. All right, so the phone booth. We've all seen the old phone booths in New York City where it's about 3 feet wide and it's all nice and short, etc. When the fighter pilots talk about it, they talk about out of airspeed, out of altitude, out of options. Maneuvering room is really the concept here. The idea being is you never want to get yourself inside the phone booth to begin with. And as we all know, talking about aviation safety, it's rarely one causal factor that causes an accident. It's a series of events that line up to create an accident. That phone booth starts to line them up pretty quickly. So we're going to talk about how to stay out of it. This iceberg here, right? We all see the iceberg, we all see the known hazards, etc. But you have everything below that. Weather, external pressures, environmental conditions, pilot proficiency and skill, and of course where you're going, the surface conditions. And then if you start clicking, it should start pulling up the bullet points. There we go. All right, keep going. There we go. All right. Talking about that phone booth, altitude, our distance, our fuel requirements, our weather at the destination, whether we need an alternate. When I start planning a flight and when I start teaching our 135 captains how to flight plan, the very first question we should always be asking ourselves, do we need an alternate? That changes the whole matrix of your flight planning capability. Airspeed. We go too fast, we burn too much fuel, there's environmental factors. I will say that the Honda is the most ISA sensitive aircraft that I've flown before. Get into a high ISA and your performance goes down tremendously. Options, all right. We all know that, especially out here on the East Coast, you could out on the East Coast, you shake a stick and there's more airports that you could land at with a runway greater than 5,000 feet. Out here on the West Coast, not so much, but there's still quite a few here. We have Centennial, there's Rocky Mountain, there's Denver International, there's Colorado Springs, and then even out into the mountains, we've got Aspen, Rifle, Telluride, Montrose, Grand Junction. There's all sorts of options that we have. Air traffic control. Trying to fly into Baltimore at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're going to find yourself very constrained about where you can go and how fast you can do it. And then there's always the external pressures. All right, continue. So how do we avoid the phone booth? The military version is 7 Ps, but we're going to keep it a little bit PG here. 6 Ps. Prior proper planning prevents poor performance. Planning is huge. We all know that flight planning is a big factor on how we conduct our business every day, but no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. It's always changing. You have to be flexible. You have to be fluid. But a good plan will take all of that into account and either already have an answer for it or a ready-made set of solutions to move forward with a different contingency. Then we move into the next part of that. Head back, please. Sorry. Nope, that's okay. As we move further into the flight, our options start to narrow down significantly. We have to be aware of where we're going, how we're getting there, and start creating our times of, all right, well, if we don't have this by this time hack, we need to be moving in a different direction. The idea is we're constantly looking and evaluating, replanning, and reassessing. OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. That's constantly what I'm doing in the aircraft. That's the thing that I'm trying to stress. We've all been there. We all remember for the pilots in here, our first cross-country flight. What are you going to do if your engine quits right now? Where are you going to land? And you're on a cross-country flight. You've never seen this area from the air before. And then the last part of this, do not let the sum of circumstances and timing exceed the capability of your skills and knowledge. That tends to happen more often than not. I would like my skill and my knowledge to keep me out of that situation in the first place, which is the end state goal of the planning stage. All right, next slide, please. All right, people ask me what the toughest part of my job is, either as a pilot or a chief pilot, and I always tell them the hardest part is realistic expectation management for everybody that I come in contact with. That is the most difficult part of my job. Next slide. All right. We all know that Honda limitations are there. They're there for a reason. They must be met every single time. We cannot exceed limitations, period. Our first limitation, our max zero fuel weight. How many passengers and how much cargo can we carry with a crew, or if you're a single pilot operator, how much can you carry? That's the first one. Our second one is our max takeoff weight. So max zero fuel weight plus the fuel, and then you can give the 80 pounds for the taxi in and taxi out. And then our last one is the runway handling, wet, and crosswind capability of the aircraft. So those are the three factors we're balancing against each other, particularly when we're doing some of the longer range flights from West Palm to Teterboro with 3 passengers. Continue. All right, so this one here, I gave an example of an impossible mission. 2 pilots, 4 passengers, 180 pounds of bags, 20 pounds of flyaway gear. We always carry 2 quarts of oil. We have our lab servicing kit, and then we have our stock. 60 pounds of crew bag, and then if we go by these passenger weights here, go ahead and hit the arrow real fast. One of these should blow up. Nope, head back. For whatever reason, they're not expanding this morning. But if you look over here off to the left side, we have a screenshot off of APG, which is our performance planning software. And you'll notice I already have 2 red warnings, and there's about 8 warnings right up at the top telling me, hey, something's not right here. This isn't able to go. We need to fix and adjust things. Right now, the taxi and the takeoff weight are out of CG. And we're trying to do just shy of a 1,000-mile flight from Boeing Field down to Scottsdale. With the fuel required, the passenger weights, etc., there's no way that this could go. We actually have to take this back to the drawing board and figure out what we're doing. What are we going to take off? How are we going to save weight? Will that weight saved actually put us back into the CG envelope? If it's not, then we have to add a fuel stop, because we're going to have to reduce the amount of fuel that we carry because of the amount of passengers that we have. Next slide, please. All right, weight and balance for real-world operations. These are things that we've ran into. For my colleagues and friends in OCC here, you'll probably remember where these are coming from. So, next slide. All right, each of the next slides demonstrates something where a flight can be done nonstop, fuel stop, or well exceeds the capability of the aircraft. This is where your participation will come in. And then we'll debrief on what the actual solution was and how we fixed it. Next slide, please. All right, first one. Using ForeFlight for this, their numbers are very accurate. Garmin Pilot's numbers are very accurate as well. I think the delta I've seen across both of them is something close to 5 pounds. Not enough to make or break a mission or being able to do something. This is a particular flight going from Naples to Jasper, which is just outside of Atlanta. This was November 110 Hotel Juliet. It's an APMG. And that we had, I think I go on to it into the next slide. Volato, we always operate with 2 crew. So it will always be a 2-pilot operation, and then we always factor in 60 pounds for our bags. So that's just our basics there. And then I used what I saw probably the easiest routing to get from point A to point B. And then you see at our bottom, we have a little bit of an extra fuel buffer for us. We go to 600 pounds. We've calculated that 480 pounds is our adequate IFR reserve. And then if we add the 120-pound contingency, that gets us to our 600 of min fuel. Next slide, please. As you can see here, 4 passengers, all of the bags, looking at about 195 in bags, 20 pounds of the flyaway for 215 pounds of bags. 4 passengers and 2 pilots were way too heavy. We were 233 pounds overweight on this one to go nonstop. So right off the bat, just looking here, what are some things that we can do? First thing that comes to mind, knock it out.
Ship some luggage.
Ship some luggage. Well,
Take off heavy. No.
so we have one guy that wants to exceed limitations. Got it. We could add a fuel stop. What else could we do? Reduce takeoff fuel. How many of you would think flying higher is a better option? Okay.
If the winds are better.
The winds are better? That's another thing. What's another thing to consider about altitude? Is that hotter than normal or colder than normal? What's the ISA? So there's another 3 factors that I like to balance: wind, temperature, and efficiency. And the nice thing is that both Garmin and ForeFlight will actually give you those numbers and give you the best average altitude for that. Next slide, please, Travis. All right, so here it is. We already know that, well, I can't tell one of my passengers to get off the aircraft. That's a non-starter right there. I'm under 135. It's 2-pilot crew, especially if we're doing eligible on-demand operations. I can't get rid of the other crew member. Still overweight. So what do? We take less fuel and go to a fuel stop? Find some point that's halfway between there and Jasper? I don't know. So what did we end up doing? Next slide, please. We ended up going to, I think we ended up going into Gainesville for the fuel stop on that one. So we found our way right up to the Panhandle, quick 20-minute turn, and off we go. 233 pounds doesn't sound like a lot. However, in my personal experience, if I were to get into an accident, I want to make sure that I've adhered to my limitations, I've adhered to manufacturer and OEM-specific guidance on how we operated the aircraft, that I plan accordingly, and I did so in accordance with all regulations. Because if the NTSB were to come along, contributing factor to the accident flight was JP Walden did not plan according to 135 regulations. I don't want to be that individual. All right, now we're going to talk about surface conditions, which is a very different animal from flight planning. Unfortunately, you get me next presentation as well, but we get to talk about the landing phase considerations as well. So we have takeoff distance, so things like brake energy. If I have to abort a takeoff, am I going to be able to do so safely on the field? Our second segment, climb gradient. And then another thing that APG does spectacularly well is the special engine failure path departures. Aspen's a common one. I think there's 5 or 6 different engine failure paths depending on how you want to tackle that one. I also know Reno has a bunch of convoluted engine failure paths out of there as well. But these are things that we have to bear in mind when we're looking at airports of where we get out of. In fact, we ran into that yesterday at Marfa, Texas. For those of you that didn't know, that there is an airport in Texas that sits at almost 5,000 feet field elevation. I never would have thought of that. I figured most of it was 1,800 feet. But in Texas, 4,898 feet, 37 degrees C. So that was quite the density altitude. And it severely narrowed our capability out of that airfield, but we can't fight physics. And then on the other side of this, takeoff and landing toll data when we look at it. Our unfactored landing distance, contamination, our wet versus dry. 30%, and that is in the Honda AFM, Chapter 4. And then our stabilized approach criteria, that's another thing. Are we actually doing a stabilized approach? All of these things change what your landing distance is going to be. So if I'm 5 knots fast on my ref speed, what is that going to equate to my landing distance? Does anybody have an idea of what that equates to landing distance in a 5 knot difference between on speed or going too fast? What'd you say, Mr. Steve? 10% for every 2 knots. So if I'm 5 knots faster, 25%. Okay. So on 5,000 feet of runway, if I'm 5 knots fast at 50 feet over the threshold, how much further down the runway am I going to be? Math is hard, especially in public in front of your peers.
You gotta have that meme up there with
The confused math? Confused math? Yeah, it's significant. So the only time that the landing data is actually accurate is if I cross the threshold at 50 feet, fully configured, ready to land. That is it. Say again?
in a laboratory. That's what you always said that. I'll talk to you about that too.
Well, Josh will be enlightening us on that. All right, next slide, please. All right, flight phase considerations and concerns. Go ahead. All right, we talk about the takeoff. There's a few of you in here that have actually flown the Honda. When you add anti-ice or de-ice fluid, it requires another additional 10% to your takeoff distance to get rid of that for the blow-off. That's a big one. Altitude, especially in summertime conditions, is going to limit our aircraft capability. Density altitude is the thing. Not only ensure that you have adequate distance, but also to meet the single engine climb gradients. Now, just out of curiosity here, if the jet presents a solution where it's not able to meet a single engine climb gradient, would that stop you from going? Show of hands say they would go if they were not able to meet the single engine climb gradient. I got 1 back there. Anybody else? 2, Neil, all right, 3, 4. How many of you would not go if you were not able to meet the single engine climb gradient? Okay, there's a few more. All right, all right. Hey, this is why we're here. AFM Chapter 5, by the way, for performance. And then I see that. Azim gets participation points today. Well done, Azim. Well done. As we all know, like landing, the crosswinds play a major factor in aircraft controllability. When we go for our takeoff run, crosswind control inputs. My personal technique, this is technique only, This is not actual guidance. This is not out of OEM. OEM just says rapid inputs may be necessary. How I personally do it, as soon as I'm coming onto the runway, I'm throwing my crosswind control inputs in, and then I'm measuring them out as I accelerate and start to gain more control effectiveness until I hit the sweet spot. The major problem is, and I see this a lot, especially with new to the aircraft, fresh out of flight safety, people don't want to put that input in, or they're putting it in a little too late, and now they're playing a catch-up game with trying to keep ahead of the phugoid of what's going on when they put that control input in too late. The big thing is sight picture. We've all seen the glare shield of the Honda, and in the second presentation, you're actually going to be able to see it. You have the top part that goes to the center column, and then it kind of curves down and then heads to the edges of the windscreen. If you think of the Honda as a wheelbarrow, you want that glare shield flat, level, and equal with the runway of choice that you're going off of. If you keep that sight picture, the controllability of the aircraft becomes much easier. Next slide, please. Climb considerations. You have range versus economy versus rate. So range, if I were to put the defaults into the CDU as I'm doing my initialization, 210 is the normal cruise climb. Solid number, there's very little fluctuation from indicated versus Mach as you get into the high altitude regime. For a rule of thumb, 200 knots or greater, ISA +5 and below, and the AOA index are at 0.5 or less. It's the equal balance between rate, altitude, and speed. Also maintains our conservation of momentum as we get up into the higher altitudes. It helps us avoid a coffin corner type situation. If we were to go from Seattle to Scottsdale with that impossible flight that we talked about earlier, it would probably take me about 30 to 35 minutes to get up to altitude, and then another 20 minutes trying to get the aircraft back on its attitude for max efficiency and speed. So that's why we always teach it like this. We want to be able to do this because it keeps the speed up and it keeps our conservation of momentum up as well. Again, we're going to talk about this ISA thing again. Use caution transiting through high ISA areas. Climb rate and true airspeeds degrade in high ISA environments. We were doing Charlotte to Austin. It was a fall afternoon, and it was ISA +25 at 28,000 feet. My climb rate was 150 to 200 feet per minute. Air traffic control said expedite, expedite, expedite to multiple different aircraft trying to do climbs. Everybody's saying unable. It's hot up here, guys. It's hot up here. And then it really is crippling on what you can and can't do. So that is a big factor that I think a lot of people overlook because they're assuming, oh, we're in a jet, ISA doesn't matter. Well, it plays a big factor for us. ATC climb limits will also eat into predicated burns. Everybody knows coming in and out of Florida, they don't really follow the typical RVSM model and directional model. There have been times where you're coming out of the south of Florida, they're going to hold you at 34, 36, or 35 and 37, and they're going to keep you there until you get up towards Destin, Clearwater, Jacksonville. And then they'll start climbing you up because everybody's also coming in from the north. They're trying to keep you underneath them before they'll send you up higher. Well, if your flight planning is requiring you to be at 410 all the way from West Palm to make it to Teterboro safely, well, you're kind of in a pickle at that point. All right, next slide, please. Oh, actually, head back. As you can see here, this is the PFD from the pilot side. And there's a couple things you're looking at. Excuse me real quick. You might be able to see this magenta caret here. That's what the computer input is. The bug speed is there. We've got our flight director showing as such. This is the AOA indexer. He's 0.5 or below. He's probably right at about 0.3. I'd even say maybe 0.275, but it's very nose low, as it should be. Obviously, this is at a lower altitude, but he'd be able to maintain this all the way up into 390, 400, 410, and if the conditions are right and the weight's right, 430. Next slide, please. Sir. Head back, right there.
Technique, and I think we're probably on the same frequency. How are you climbing the aircraft here? Do you use flight level change or do you use VS? What do you do?
All right.
I know I do.
Well, while we're here, let's talk about it. What do you do?
I use VS.
You use VS, your vertical speed. Of the Honda Jet pilots in here, when you're climbing up to altitude, what do you guys like to utilize? Pitch? Okay. VS? Azim? You use both? Okay.
Just depends on what I'm planning through, the temperature, and whether I have passengers or not. And I scare the shit out of me.
What I personally do, I use flight level change until I get up through transition altitude. Or if it starts hunting in flight level change, vertical speed, 2,500 to 3,000 feet per minute will get you through 10,000. From 10,000 to 20,000, 2,000 a minute actually will allow you to accelerate. So it's more of a cruise climb than it is a straight up climb. Once we get up into the 30s, especially once we hit the transition layer, I'm limiting it at about 1,500 to 1,000 feet per minute, depending on conditions. And then under no circumstances am I bringing it below 500 feet per minute. That is our minimum IFR climb rate, right, and descent rate. Under no circumstances will I ever let the aircraft get down there. If we're not able to sustain that 500 feet, hey, we need to level off here, get a little bit more airspeed, and then we can try again. So that's, yeah, step climbing. So that's my personal technique. I've also flown with an individual that swears by the pitch method. And he puts the aircraft at 6.5 degrees nose up and lets it sit there and climb itself all the way up. He's not having to touch or move anything. And the airspeed trend stays right within 5 to 7 knots of target airspeed. It's pretty unique. Personally, I like having a little bit more fine-tuned control than just pointing it at 6.5 degrees nose up.
Well, a quick note. I believe to certify the aircraft, I'm not a Part 23 certification guy, but it has to be able to maintain 500 feet through a certain group of flight regimes to get to altitude as a minimum. So sometimes if I'm maybe task saturated or something's going on, I might just set, if I'm high enough and the ice is under control, I might just set it at 500. So in case I lose awareness of what I'm doing for some strange reason, or maybe I'm giving some instruction or dealing with who knows what, I know that I'm not gonna get into trouble. Keep it at 500 BS, and then I can get back to it. It's just a safety feature that I do personally.
I like it. Questions about this real quick?
Yeah, there's actually no guarantee in the data. I mean, first of all, the performance, the ground performance data is not accurate at all, so it's still certification requirement at all. And the altitude capability tables, they're based on 300.
300.
So you want to be careful with setting 500. If you get up to the ISO plus 5 or higher, up in the 40s, you may run out of steam.
I would think 500 would be safer than setting a pitch, though. I don't know.
Are you referencing VS versus
VS.
pitch? Okay, okay. Yeah. Well, you were asking about certification, and I believe that's what. Okay. So the capability tables are based on a 300 foot per minute climb?
I think it's 300 to 300, it's not 500.
Okay, okay. Yeah. All right. Azim?
JP, I was always taught that flight level change is the preferred method for climbing because it ensures that you don't stall. Whereas you can stall with
It's a safe way to do it.
but the Honda Jet doesn't practically perform in an ideal way for the passenger if you use flight level change because it gets hunting and it moves up and down way too much.
So there's a reason why I go into flight level change right off the get-go, especially in terminal environments, it's because it's very easy to set that. But once that nose starts to porpoise, which is the hunting tendency that you talk about, that's when I change it over to vertical speed. There is such thing as too good of an autopilot. This would be one of those examples because for flight level change, it's trimming the aircraft to maintain that set speed. But it's also taking wind inputs into the air data computers, and that's what it's looking at. Well, okay, oh, wait, nope, yeah. And it becomes a porpoising effect. That's when I move over to vertical speed. As soon as I see that hunting tendency come in, it's just enough. It's about 5 seconds worth of it, vertical speed, and now we're back onto a nice smooth pitch attitude. Azim.
I think the key is, in my opinion, is energy management. You know, there are times when I've flown this airplane, I get to 35 in the middle of summer, 38, and all of a sudden I can't even get 500 foot per minute. So it's energy management. A lot of times what I see in training and checking is we blast off and we maintain that speed or that pitch or vertical speed, and all of a sudden you lose your energy. And we file for 430 and we're at 39, we can't even get to 200 foot per minute. So, you know, what we teach is manage your, it doesn't matter what you use, 200 feet per minute, 500 foot per minute, vertical speed, flight level change. The key is maintain your energy. You know, I never filed for 430 ever, even when I know I always file for 39 or 40. And then I ask for higher, because I don't want to be that idiot. They're like, all right, put it 430, and then you're at 380. And I'm like, can we stop here at 390?
What's that clacking in the background?
Right. You know, whatever method you use, just be sure that you're maintaining that energy. You're looking at your eyes, you're looking at your flight plan. It tells you exactly what your eyes is going to be. Now you have to look at your altitude. What am I going to do today? Where am I going? Am I going east? Am I going south? Am I going west? So, you know, planning, you know, I'll hit that. Wondering if I get a chance to be on.
So out of everybody in here, show of hands, pilots, whether you're a private pilot, certificated, test pilot, military pilot, how many of everybody in here is a pilot? Okay, so more than half. When you were first learning how to fly, what was the big thing that showed you guys? Pitch and power? Everybody remember that? Okay. How many in here remember Air France 447? Okay. That was over the Atlantic. A330 takes out of Sao Paulo, I believe, and back to Paris. And at 37,000 feet, they start getting unreliable airspeed. Pitch and power is what's going to save the day at that point. If my airspeed's unreliable, what's the next thing I'm going to go and look at? All right. Airspeed unreliable. What else can I cross-reference to ensure, hey, I'm relatively there? AOA. Okay, deck angle, that would be one thing. What else am I going to reference for a ground speed, though? GPS. Okay. Which, by the way, the boys in blue right now are messing with GPS clock and spoofing and jamming, and that's one of the things that they actually mess with is the speed. So that's another thing to take into consideration. The GPS jamming is not an unsafe thing in this aircraft. You lose all the magenta capability and you go into green needles and heading in altitude and off we go. But yeah, Air France, airspeed unreliable. Since that accident, there's actually been a lot of that, especially in the extended envelope training. Now, when we go through our initial type at Honda, that is not something that they teach, the extended envelope. But this is something that is taught, especially the airspeed unreliable at most of the airline 121 initial and recurrence. In this airplane, there is 3 primary different input sensors for the airspeed. You have what's on the GPS. The amount of redundancy is enough of a capability in and of itself. However, we pay attention to our deck angle. That AOA indexer is huge. That is one of my favorite tools to reference, especially when I'm coming in for a landing. The scan is the important part. Are we watching everything? Where are we looking at comparative to our plan in actual performance, anticipated performance versus actual directives from ATC? Next slide, please. Okay, Here's another one. Again, you're going to notice we're talking about the East Coast here quite a bit, South Florida, all the way up to Teterboro. We know that if we come out this way, that all the worrying areas are now shut down. I believe they call that area the giant killer airspace out there. Once that shuts down, we're able to get out over the water and make our way up to Teterboro. The big thing is we need a raft. If we don't have a raft, well, then we're not in compliance with the rules and regs, and that's not a good thing. When I did the flight planning on this one, you'll notice I have the Volato required fuel there, which is our 600-pound man policy. Part 91 required fuel would be the 2439, and that is including the 480 pounds that we've calculated for our min fuel. The change in weight between the fuel and the takeoff, the raft, is only going to be about 170 pounds. That's not all that much, but for Part 91, you could do this all day long. And again, we will always have a raft where we're 50 nautical miles off from power-off gliding distance from the shore. As you can see, this routing, it takes us out way east, out over the Atlantic, and then making landfall somewhere over the Wilmington area as we make our way up into the Teterboro, New York Metro. Next slide, please. There you go. For everybody that wasn't able to see, now you can see. Next slide.
Can I just interject one very quick, cool thing?
Sure.
We put air tags on all of our rafts and in our crew vehicles. So I was watching one of our tracks and going, your raft is 285 miles off the coast. Only because we have Wi-Fi on all the aircraft, so it's really convenient. You know? It's another way to provide really good oversight without being invasive.
Don't worry about the mic.
It's incredible what we do with technology.
Yeah.
Matt,
We're good for
a big proponent of that. We'll talk about that.
Excellent. All right, now we're talking about the overland side, and this is more often than what not is what happens for us in the Honda. 4 passengers, or it's 2 adults, 2 kids, 200 pounds of bags. That's a pretty common one. We have to fly over land at this point. We can barely come off the shore, not by much, but this is a more common overland routing. Now, if I look at it, you notice that there's recommended and then preferred underneath with for flight. It'll zoom back in if you click. There we go. Notice it says flight level 430 right there. When I look at a planning software, is that a mandated altitude? Is that the only way that's going to get cleared for me, or is that something that is optional? It's optional. So I'm going to keep looking at that, knowing capability, and I got to tell you, these HF-120 turbofans are awesome. They're a very capable jet engine, and yes, I love going up to 43 because now we're down to, 210, 220 a side?
King Air 350 fuel burn rate.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's very, very capable. However, 43 might not be the best for this. And then we all know that once we get up towards the Virginia side, we're going to start descending at about 300 miles out. In any case, the delta here, if you want to click back real quick and actually unzoom that. The change in this was 112 pounds from the previous slide. So that's the change in routing. Next slide.
So it gained us 123 pounds of fuel.
By going over land, it's actually causing us more of a fuel burn than if we had gone over the water. Going over the water would have actually been more efficient for us.
Even taking the raft.
Even taking the raft. Even taking the raft. The over water would have been more efficient. So more of a straight line. Because when we do the overland coming out of Florida, they're going to have you follow the panhandle. So now I'm going up to the west before I head back north and east.
And our 135 compliant rafts that are 8-man overloaded are 38 pounds only, so they're pretty compact.
It's very nice and light. So, and this just goes to show, this is a JQ3 arrival into Teterboro, and they start you down very, very far out. I think it's Ramey is where they start putting you at 27,000 feet. This whole stretch right here is 247 nautical miles. We'll call it a plus or minus 10 nautical mile for the change of vector, etc. Air traffic control is going to do it going in and out of the whole Northeast corridor. We all know that's a fact, that's a known factor. We just have to be ready for it. The key words in fuel regulations is planned fuel. I can plan to land at 615 pounds, but if I get in the air, we're making our way up, hey, Honda Jet 420 X-ray Echo, clear direct to Snow Hill. We're making our way in there, we start contacting DC Center, and Washington Center goes, hey, expect holding at Snow Hill. It's going to be about 20 minutes. There's metering into Teterboro. Expect holding at Snow Hill. Oh, okay. So we go into our CDU, we do our little butt magic, and we find out that, hey, I can hold for 17 minutes. Or can I? Right? Expect further clearance is a vital part of this. And then they go, well, wait a minute, just kidding. Can you maintain 250 knots or better? Yeah, all right, hang on real quick. Just stand by. I go in there, and now I change my descent speed from economy to 250. And now my fuel predicator says I'm going to land at 385 pounds. Well, am I going to continue on that? Would I be unable? My fuel predicator says 385 pounds. Am I going to continue at that airspeed? No? How many of you would do it? Azim?
You really can't. If you go below 220 aside, the book says land at the nearest suitable airport, right? If you get your fuel low lights,
Right.
So that's the caveat to that. But you're burning fuel that was not planned.
Right.
So that's what the reserve fuel is for.
Okay.
For unplanned things. Now, the wise man would say, if it's IMC, here, Trent Mercer, here I come.
Right. 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 So plan, right? No plan survives first contact with the enemy. They even have the QRH up there, right? Land at the nearest suitable airport. Well, Teterboro happens to be the nearest suitable. It's where I needed to go. They have services, they have fuel, it's suitable, right?
That's where lawyers might say, well, what is suitable?
Right, exactly. However, but again, as I talked about on the East Coast, you could shake a stick. Look at how many different airports are popping up there. The blue ones are the big ones. Those are the towered fields. I've got Dulles. I have DCA. I have Baltimore. I have Philadelphia. I've got Harrisburg. Well before I ever get to that point. So if I got to stop and get gas, put another 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds on, then that's what we do. But the big thing is we made an attempt, but we did so in a safe manner. We did so in a compliant manner, and we did so in accordance with regulations. Next slide, please. All right, terminal phase. When do we actually make this decision to go or not go? Or when we're in the airplane and we actually need to go somewhere, when do I know, all right, yeah, my intended point of landing is not going to work? Sir.
Can I talk about this right here?
Sure.
Hey, go to the microphone. So it'll pick up on the recording. There you go.
How many here, those that are pilots, are scared shitless of talking to the ATC? You just don't want to ask for anything because, one, you're scared of everybody else hearing you, and two, hearing no, unable, right? There are some of us. I know nobody here wants to raise their hands, but sometimes I'm that way. I'm like, maybe today's not the time to ask. But it never hurts to ask. It never hurts to ask for something different and say unable, right? I always ask, every time they tell me, hey, descend maintain 250, 400 nautical miles out, the first thing I ask is, can we get a PD on that? And you'll be amazed. Sometimes they have a good day, and I mean, Sarah's over here. How many times have you allowed people to stay up high, and then all of a sudden you just bring the throttles to idle and bring it down? Using the VNAV function. If they ask you cross so-and-so at this altitude, well, use the VNAV function. Keep yourself high as possible. This airplane can descend at 6 degrees if you plan it right. But ask the question. Use ATC. They're there for us. I mean, I've not gotten into an argument with air traffic controllers, but I have gotten my way sometimes. I'm like, well, we're going to have to need a fuel stop if you let me do this now. And then get on the ground and call Washington. Now you get into an argument with them, but they're there for you. Utilize those resources and tell them when you're not able to do something. You know, so.
It's always a no if you don't ask.
Exactly.
Just gotta use the right words, though. Because if you use the wrong code words, bad things happen, as I found out. Like they gave me a reroute, and I told them, I said, hey, with this reroute, I'm gonna be at minimum fuel. I need something shorter, and then they cleared me direct. I was like, score, I won. And then when I got to change over to the tower, they asked me what emergency services I needed on landing. So apparently, you're not saying minimum fuel.
I always compliment the ATC controller on how nice their shoes are, and then I ask for what. Does that work? It works good. Does that work? Nope. Battery's dead. You can use the microphone over here or the handheld. Oh yeah, put it on. I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Did it work now? There we go. All right. How's that shoes trick work out for you, Josh?
It's good.
Okay.
Sometimes I sit in the box.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, next slide, please. All right, here we go. All right, this here is Torrance, California, Luis Zamperini Field. If we look at ForeFlight will tell me at this runway that it's 5,001 feet long. Perfect for a Honda jet, right? I should be able to stop on 5,000 feet of runway, especially if it's dry. Okay. However, further looking at ForeFlight, I noticed that there's two displaced thresholds. There's 541 feet on one side, 540 on the other, for a grand total of 1,081 feet being eaten up. This would actually be 3,919 feet available. All right. What factors out here change my stopping distance? Just throw the first thing that comes to your mind.
Slope. Here, runway slope.
Runway slope, that is a factor. Headwind or tailwind? Landing weight. How many of you think about what the actual surface is made out of? Does that make a difference? Okay.
If it's wet or not.
If it's wet, right? Brake energy limits. There's another one. All right. We all know that these plays a factor. And if I go into the CDU and I type it in, and I put my landing distance factor of 1.0. I want the unfactored landing distance, and I put that in there. Come out to a number of, we'll call it 2,800, 2,900 feet. And I was like, oh crap, they're reporting rain. And as we're coming down, it's VFR out there. It's at nighttime, but I'm looking, I can see the lights reflecting off the streets because it's been that wet. So I know it's probably saturated wet. And it's not just little spitty raindrops. It's barely beginning to rain. We're talking, it's been pouring all day long. So it's pretty wet. I go in there and I type my numbers in, and now it says I require 4,920 feet to stop. That's wet unfactored. We're not even getting into 135 yet. This is just part 91. 4,920 feet of runway available. Can I land at this airport with that number? Okay. He says once. How many of you are familiar with the LA Basin area? We got one. There is. Are we ready for it? Orange County, Long Beach. We have Hawthorne, we have LA International, we have Burbank, we have Van Nuys, we have Ontario, we have Riverside. There are so many airports that we can shake a stick at. Los Angeles is 8 miles to the north. Long Beach is 9 miles to the east. Both of them have over 10,000 foot long runways. Would it be smarter to prosecute and keep going into this airport, or would it be easier to go land at LA, leave the aircraft there, fight traffic like Mad Max on the 405 for an hour to get back south, Or would you try and push it, now risking an overrun, potential hull loss, fire, and or harm to your occupants? The answer is pretty clear to me. Decision making is everything with these aircraft, as it is with any aircraft. The decision making matrices have to be solid. Aeronautical judgment, that is the one thing I can't teach. I can help add tools to your toolbox to help you make a smart aeronautical decision. But what I cannot do is actually be there to tell you what you can and cannot do. You're going to hear later on from both Mr. Pat Moran, our Director of Safety, and from Mr. Azim, our VP of Standards, about how standardization and robust safety culture play a role in those decision-making matrices as well. Next slide, please. All right, that's all I have for this portion of the presentation. Question and answer time. Throw them at me. What you got?
What's the scariest landing you ever did in the Honda jet?
Okay, I was doing Long Island to Chicago. I was planning to go into Aurora. Snowstorm had came through. So Aurora, my primary, both of my secondary and tertiary alternates also snowed in and not been plowed. Chicago Midway was the only airport that I could go to. However, the winds were like 02015, gust 25, and the field had just been resurfaced and plowed. But I was doing the numbers, and I kept getting a wrong error, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. It's either that or we're going into O'Hare. I don't know which one is going to work. Midway is going to be better for what we intended to do. So as I come in, I was flying a single pilot, by the way. This was a single pilot reposition in Chicago. So I'm coming in. It's really blowing hard. I mean, that gusting was no kidding, it was actually gusting. So I'm fighting it, and as soon as I touched down, I think I was as most ginger on the brakes as I've ever been on an airplane before. But once they actually started applying, I used about all 5,920 feet available runway, and I was like, hey, I'm not going into the EMAS today. This is a good sign. But it took every ounce of runway available that was there, and it landed on the numbers. So that would be one of them. And then there was another one with a ret runway where controllability was called into question. It was also like my 8th or 9th landing in the airplane, but that one tended to be it. But we didn't go off the runway, so that was a positive experience. What else? OCC is relatively quiet this morning.
Yeah, we have the majority of our ops control center team here. The group of experts on Volato regalia. So.
More questions?
What's the longest flight you ever did in the Honda jet, time-wise?
Time-wise, 3 hours, 45 minutes. And that was White Plains to Naples, Florida. Severe weather avoidance program in effect, so they actually took us way out over the North Horn of Long Island and then back down, and then once we got off the east coast of Florida, we were just getting vectored all over the back 40. I did have to declare min fuel on that one.
Intrail spacing?
Oh yeah, and then Miami Center wanted to get into an argument with me saying, oh, you want me to declare for you? And I said, no, I just said min fuel. Oh, I'm going to declare on your behalf. Sir, min fuel, not emergency, min fuel. So there was that one.
It's always bad when they vector use 270 off of Jacksonville.
So, well, if there's no further questions, I'm going to wrap this side of it up. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, which is always good. But again, we're going to segue into the landing performance side of this. I think everybody's going to enjoy that a little bit more. But that's all I have for now. So thank you all for this first part, and we'll see you for part 2 next.